I am N.S. Venkatraman. I am speaking on behalf of Nandini Consultancy Center, a firm of chemical engineers and chemical business consultants based in Chennai and Singapore. All of us very well know that there is a conflict of interest between India and China, and this conflict of interest have been steadily widening over the last several years. In spite of such conditions, India is now heavily dependent on China for several of its requirements, such as chemical intermediates, active pharma ingredient, lithium-ion cell, battery cell, spare parts, and so many other commodities that India has been importing from China. Considering the trade relations between both the countries and balance of trade, it is found that the balance of trade is heavily in favor of China. Given these kind of conditions, several persons in India feel that India should take some steps to reduce its import dependence on China and do it as safely as possible and as much as possible. The question is whether India will be able to reduce the import dependence on China to any significant extent in the foreseeable future. Of course, this can happen if Indian economy and industrial growth would outshine China in the course of time. But the question here is, will Indian economy and will Indian industrial growth outshine China? If so, when it will do? This is the subject of discussions that we have taken up for today. In the last few years, several credible international agencies, such as World Bank, International Monetary Fund, have been applauding the growth and performance of Indian economy in very liberal terms. They have said, and so many other credible agencies have also said, that India is the fastest growing economy in the world today. While there are well-developed countries like China, USA, UK are facing recessionary trends and are under inflationary pressures, we find Indian economy is intact. This state of Indian economy, which has been well recognized across the world today, have made several Indians feel a sense of euphoria, thinking that perhaps Indian economy is now in the top of the world. It is really so. If we examine very carefully, the optimism of international credible agencies, credible credit rating agencies such as International Monetary Fund, World Bank, etc., applauding India's economy has certain basis. It is not any willful, optimized kind of conclusion, but this is on facts and ground realities. Now let us have a look at the justification for International Monetary Fund to applaud such India's economy and growth. Let us take a few pointers, positive pointers in India. Of course, India is the fifth largest economy in the world today and is well placed to achieve spectacular growth of its economy in the coming years. In the last 9 years, after Prime Minister Modi has taken over, several reform measures have been introduced in India. A number of infrastructure projects have been launched, apart from social welfare measures to lift the countrymen from poverty level. Defense equipments production has increased phenomenally, and defense shipments have risen by more than 10 times since 2016. In the period 2016-17, defense exports from India stood at rupees 1,521 crore, and in the year 2022-23, the exports have reached a figure of rupees 15,920 crore. That means the exports have increased by 5 to 6 times in a short period of few years. India's cumulative solar module manufacturing nameplate capacity has more than doubled to 38 gigawatt from March 2023, from 18 gigawatt in March 2022. Is again a very impressive performance. Now, India is the largest provider of generic drugs globally. On May 8, 2020, Indian Council of Medical Research launched Made in India COVID vaccine campaign, and Indian pharma companies produced massive quantity of the COVID vaccine in a very short period, not only for India's needs, but for needs of several other countries in the world. The world was pleasantly surprised to see India's such spectacular achievement in the field of pharmaceuticals. While India is a net importer of petrochemicals and intermediates, India now has become a net exporter of diverse range of specialty chemicals. This is no mean achievement. Government of India has sanctioned rupees 40,900 crore to over 80,630 accounts for the Startup India scheme in the last 7 years. And we are seeing the benefits now. There are so many other pointers, such as space research and so on. All these impressive growth trends, one clearly show that the optimism of the international credit agencies, such as International Monetary Fund about India, are totally justified and appropriate. Now, let's have a look at the scenario comparing India and China. Probably the best way of assessing India's economic and industrial growth profile and measuring its performance and the future prospects would be to compare India with China. This would be so since the economic status of India and China around a few decades back, in the early 1980s, were almost at the same level. And both the countries are highly populated countries and with high population density and reasonable level of natural and mineral resources. In such circumstances, it would be very appropriate to compare the state of economy of India and China. Of course, India is heavily dependent on import of crude oil and natural gas, which are essential input to sustain industrial and economic growth. However, condition faced by China is no better. China is also a very large importer of crude oil and natural gas and is extensively dependent on the international supply sources. For further analysis of India's growth profile and track record in comparison to China, let us look at certain indicative figures. For example, let us take the land area. India's land area is 3.287 million square meter. As against this, China's land area is 9.597 million square kilometer. That means China's land area is nearly 3 times more than that of India. But look at the population. In the year 2021, India's population is 140.76 crore and China's population is 141.24 crore. In other words, in spite of having the land area 3 times more than India, China's population and India's population are almost on par now. Now let us look at the population density. If you look at the population density, India's population density is 431.11 per square kilometer. As against this, China's population density is 153 per square kilometers. That means it is 4 times India's population density nearly 3 to 4 times over China. This is a big drag on India's economic growth. Now let us take another fact, foreign direct investment. During the period 2021-22, the foreign direct investment in India was 84,835 million US dollar. As against this, during the same period, 2021-22, the foreign direct investment in China was 180.96 billion US dollar. Mind you, as far as India, I'm giving the figure in million. As far as China, I'm giving the figure in billion. So that means the foreign direct investment in India is nearly 8 times less than what China has achieved. Now, let us look into likely GDP growth. India's GDP growth during the period 2023-24 is expected to be 6.4%. As against this, China's GDP growth is expected to be only 5%. In this respect, you find a scenario where India is better placed than China as far as GDP growth is concerned. But the fact is that we need to keep in mind the base of Indian economy is much smaller than that of China. Now, look at the figures, some other figures of production figures. Let us take the coal. India's production of coal is somewhere around 892 million ton per annum. As against this, China's production of coal is 4,500 million ton per annum. That means more than 4 times that of India. Now let us take the wind power capacity in 2022. It is India's case, it is 41.9 gigawatt GW, whereas China's wind power capacity is 328.48 GW. As a matter of fact, during the period 2021, 70% of the world capacity buildup for wind power has happened only in China. Let us take the solar power capacity. In the year 2022, India's solar power capacity is 64 GW, whereas China is 392.61 GW. So all these basic figures show that China is far ahead of India, except in the case of this industry GDP growth rate, which is not very significant because India's base is much smaller than China's economy base. Now let us take some more figures, some more very, very latest figures. Let us take the production of wafers. Wafers are the essential component of the solar panel and has a very important role to play in the growth of the solar industry. If you take India, the solar wafer capacity, production capacity in India today is almost negligible. We are totally importing it. Instead of that, China accounts for 97% of the global production of wafers. You look at the difference. Now let us take the other figure, lithium-ion battery. India is now facing a lot of stress on the electric motors, electric vehicles. For electric vehicles, the essential component is lithium-ion battery. In the lithium-ion battery, the essential component is lithium-ion cell. Now let us compare the figures between India and China. Today, in spite of the fact that India is paying huge emphasis on the growth of the electric vehicles, there is no production of lithium-ion cell in India today. India is absolutely dependent on China. Whereas China's capacity for lithium-ion cell is as high as 750 gigawatt hours. It's one of the largest capacity in the world that China has as for lithium-ion cell. Whereas India has not started producing lithium-ion cell at all. Now let us take another figure called graphene. Graphene is a very important product, which is an emerging product, which a lot of applications, development efforts are being taken place for graphene. As a matter of fact, there are research efforts now going on to produce semiconductor chips from graphene. And graphene is considered as one of the most important emerging products in the world scenario. If you take this graphene production, India does not produce any graphene. It is nil. Whereas, what is the figure for China? The 630,000 ton per annum. Look at the figure. 630,000 ton per annum is the production figure of the graphene in China. India is not producing. Let us take the case of silicon metal. Silicon metal is made from silicon sands, which India has enough adequate quantity. And silicon metal is a very important component for solar cell and solar panels and as well the metallurgical industry. What is the production of India for silicon metal? Zero. We are not producing silicon metal at all. Whereas production of China is 6 million ton per annum. I repeat, 6 million ton per annum is the production of silicon metal in China. Let us take the case of polycrystalline silicon, which is again a very important component for the solar panel industry, for the production of solar panels and wafers and all that. What is the Indian production of polycrystalline silicon? Zero. We are not producing at all. Whereas China's production is 1.6 million ton. 1.6 million ton per annum of polycrystalline silicon China is producing. India is producing zero. Now let us take another product called titanium sponge. For production of titanium sponge, the feedstock, basic raw material is ilmenite. India has got 12% of the total world reserves of ilmenite. We got a lot of quantity of ilmenite in Kerala, Tamil Nadu, Odisha, Andhra Pradesh, and so on. In spite of this fact, the production of titanium sponge in India is only 500 tons. Now, what is China's figure? China's figure is 180,000 tons per annum. This is the China's figure. So all these figures indicate what spectacular progress that China has made since 1980s, when India and China economy and industry were almost on par. That is the 4 decades, China has made spectacular progress, whereas India has lost the race with China in the last 4 decades. The above figures, which are a few illustrative comparative examples, obviously indicate that as on date, the status of India's economy and industrial profile are much lower compared to that of China, though the economy of both China and India were at the nearly same level in 1980s. Now, I pointed out several positive pointers for India, where India is forging ahead. There is no doubt about it. But the question is, what is the speed at which India is moving? What is the speed at which China is moving? That is the point that we need to keep in view while comparing whether India can outshine China. Now let us go and slither deep into this and find out how is it that China has made such spectacular progress in a period of 4 decades from 1980 onwards, which India has not been able to do. Let us look at the details now. See, as a matter of fact, China has a totalitarian regime, with media being heavily censored, personal freedom of people severely curtailed, and rule of law by force rather than rule of law by consent. The ground reality is that China is pretending to be a communist country, and it is so only in name, and is virtually adopting the policies and methods of capitalist economy. Foreign direct investment has been an important part of the Chinese economy since the 1980s, when its big leap forward started taking place. To accelerate the process of opening to foreign capital and foreign technology, the Chinese government has been providing favored treatment to foreign direct investment and foreign direct investors. That include tax incentives, loosening of administrative restrictions, and so many other proactive policy measures in favor of the overseas investors. Realizing that China needs massive overseas investment and well-developed technology from abroad to exploit its full potential, from 1980s onwards, China liberalized its economy to the extent of any other capitalist economy, and threw open its market and investment potential to international and multinational companies, and it has done it in a very liberal manner. As multinational companies are all the time looking for market openings, invitation from Chinese government to invest in China became irresistible attraction for the multinational companies and overseas organizations. Several of them came to China with huge investments and updated technologies, which immensely benefited China in a variety of ways, including significant and far-reaching technology gains. What was another attraction for multinational companies entering China is the Chinese government strictly maintained its promises to them and ensured well-structured and orderly political and economic climate so that multinational companies and overseas organizations can comfortably work and stay in China. Now they're all there in large numbers, and they're by and large very happy and satisfied with their said in so many forums in recent years. Even as multinational companies came in a big way to China, Chinese government also encouraged and facilitated the growth of domestic companies so that many of the domestic Chinese companies could acquire the technology capability by learning from multinational companies to compete with the multinational companies in China itself in the course of time. At the same time, China continued to invest in public sector companies like Sinopec and encourage collaboration between domestic companies and overseas organizations readily and liberally. Under such conditions, today, China's industrial and economic structure is an elegant mix of private-owned domestic companies, government-owned public sector companies, and multinational companies, as well as joint ventures. The fact is that all these four entities are complementing each other, and there appears to be no conflict of interest between them at all. Today, the confidence level of the multinational companies and overseas organizations to operate in China is with regard to the stable policy of the Chinese government. Their confidence level in the stable policy of the Chinese government is so high that these companies, multinational companies, overseas organizations abroad, are contributing to further growth of Chinese economy and technology standard in significant way. There are very many multinational companies like DuPont, BASF, Dow, and others who are all deep in China right now. And in the future development plans and expansion plans and corporate planning exercise, they have all made it very clear that further investment in China is a part of their stable long-term policy measure. That is something which we have to take note of. All said and done, the underlying reason for spectacular economic and industrial growth of China since 1980s is that China has thoughtfully created a situation which is a win-win situation for both China and multinational companies and overseas organizations. Now, the fact is, China has gained. China has gained by way of investment. China has gained by way of technology inputs, and multinational companies and overseas organizations have gained by getting a market space in China. This is a win-win situation and an elegant mix-up of policy measures of the Chinese government. Now, having seen this, first we saw about the multinational companies in India that are yet to make, we are going to discuss right now. First, we saw about the World Bank complementing India's economy. Then we also compared India and China with the bigger production figures and achievement figures. Then we also tried to explain what could be the basic reason for China's industrial economic growth in such a spectacular manner over a period of 4 decades. Now let us look at the final million-dollar question: can India match China? Let us look into the details with a detached outlook, with an objective outlook, and with an analytical mindset. Though India has made significant progress in multiple directions, as outlined above, particularly in the last 9 years, the question is whether India can catch up with China's present level of growth, and outshine China at any time in future. India is endowed, no doubt, with large area and coastal belt, different climate and soil conditions, mineral resources, well-established agriculture base, and we also have army of scientists, engineers, and technologists. Certainly, India has the potential to match China in economic and industrial growth. The question is whether it can happen. The question is, will it happen? The question is, will the Indian government and Indian people will ensure that whether this would happen? Let us look into this. However, the ground reality in India today that India lacks large-scale investment capability and also lacks well-developed technology to realize its full potential. Therefore, it is absolutely necessary and it is inevitable that India has to create appropriate conditions to make it attractive for overseas investors with updated technology to invest and operate in India. We need to do this as early as possible, and necessarily this is a precondition for further growth and prosperity of Indian economy. Further, what is required to achieve such big leap forward in India is that India should exhibit government capability, what I call as governance capability, ensure growth-oriented political structure, promote innovation and R&D capability. Further, India has to create a progressive work culture climate where countrymen, Indians, would be committed to attain sustained growth by hard efforts, and they need to do it similar to what Chinese people have exhibited in the last few decades. The question is whether Indians can match China with regard to hard work and with regard to commitment for growth. That is again a million-dollar question. In this context, one cannot but point out that in China, apart from the proactive policies of the government of China, people in China responded to the opportunities by exploiting the developing favorable conditions that is created by the proactive policies of the Chinese government. The question here is, the million-dollar question again, the question here is whether Indians can emulate Chinese citizens with such greed for results and quick achievement. I am deliberately using the word greed, because greed for achievement is what is required in India today. An issue in India, which China does not have, is the democratic structure in India and the unrestricted freedom of speech and action enjoyed by the citizens. As a result, every step of the government of India become a matter of debate and counter view. And in recent years, several massive projects in India have been stopped or delayed or prevented from operating due to agitations and protests. It appears that the country is losing industrial and economic growth opportunities due to such permissive conditions, which are becoming negative aspects today. And many wonder whether India is paying a big price for its duty, democratic structure, and democratic belief. Often, government policies in India are revised or changed too frequently due to political and other pressures, and such conditions is also a matter of concern to overseas investors It is a matter of concern to Indian investors also. In such conditions, the multinational companies and investors from abroad face sort of uncertain conditions in India and cannot get the needed level of confidence to operate in India, similar to what they enjoy in China, where there is a consistency in policies over a long-term period. With frequent elections and multiple political parties in India, a number of political parties being family controlled, development of Western interests in Indian democracy structure have become a hurdle for India's progress. This is the ground reality, and this has been necessarily pointed out. India has the potentials in multiple ways to achieve the type of progress that China has made. But it appears that India's progress will be much less than the potential level in view of the present political structure and the mindset of Indians to force decisions by one group or the other, and due to the immediate willingness to operate, to launch agitation, even for trivial matters. Now, sometimes, even without having larger economic interests of the country in view, protests and agitations are being launched. This is a matter of high concern and is a matter of grave importance. If such conditions were to continue to prevail in India and would not be checked before long, the economic and industrial growth of India would be much less than the potential level, and India outshining China in economic and industrial growth would bring only as a matter of pipe dream. This is not a desirable situation at all. But what really we are going to see here is Indian democratic structure, democratic condition will continue, and India will always cherish freedom of speech, freedom of action, and they would not try to sacrifice it at any cost. As such conditions are likely to continue in India, the chain of progress or the growth of progress or the speed of progress is likely to be much less than that of China, and this is a ground reality. Thank you very much.